I'm opening with this image, which is a detail from, it's my screen. It's a detail from an image from the 1760s in Japan, because my research has been focused on 18th century Japanese script practices. And here I'd like to draw your attention to the pages of the book that the woman is reading. And I believe that these are the kinds of materials that challenge modern practices of reading in ways that have slightly been touched on so far over the course of the conference and this morning. This is an example of the book of the same period, and clearly the woodblock printed page has a very distinct character, which is very different from the modern edition, which is due to the different technologies of reproduction. On the left is woodblock print, and on the right, I'm going to call it typography, but by that, I'm including post-typographic technologies as well. And it's important to note that movable type was available in East Asia for a long time before Gutenberg, but Japan only switched at the beginning of the 20th century under pressure from Western modernity, which is an entire story in itself. And instead, I'm going to talk about the nature of the difference and suggest that the two forms of text involve different processes of reading. And since the most salient characteristic of woodblock printed text is its brush-written character, I want to first examine the mechanics of brush writing. And I'm not going to subject you to a calligraphy lesson, but I'm going to illustrate the process of brush writing with perhaps the most simple character in the Sinitic script, which is the number 1, a horizontal line, in Chinese I, Japanese ichi. And these are some examples, except they are not all the number 1. Ichi is not just a horizontal line, and only one of these is the character for 1. So here it is again, with instructions from a modern calligraphy teacher about how to write this character correctly. So although this is a 2-dimensional shape, the brush acts in 3 dimensions because it's pressed into the paper at the beginning and at the end of the line in a manner that creates the correct shape. And if I ask you to follow the very tips of the hairs of the brush here, especially at the end of the stroke, you can see that while the paper is on the horizontal plane, there's perpendicular movement relative to the paper, the brush pressed down so that the body of the brush makes the wide line, and then lifted so the tip of the brush forms the end of the stroke. So the 2-dimensional figure on the page is created 3-dimensionally. And these 3 dimensions are fundamental to the shape of letter forms in brush writing. As woodblock print is a facsimile reproduction of the original brushwork, the fat and thin lines which represent the 3rd dimension are carefully reproduced by the block cutter. But here I want to extend the 3rd dimension into space. This is 2 descriptions from 2 different calligraphy teachers who explain what they call kokyaku, the empty or invisible line which joins the real lines left by ink on paper. And they demonstrate that the line of the brush is continuous even when it's not in contact with the paper. And this isn't some esoteric transmission or ritual formalism. Although the page holds only the marks of the ink, the invisible line which connects them is clearly visible to those trained in the brush. And the 4th dimension of writing is time, as Amalia mentioned. At its most basic, we can follow the movement of the instrument of writing across the paper. And this is a highly cursive example which shows it very clearly. So the line of motion with its beginning and end shows the passage through time of the writing instrument. But when it comes to brush writing, the dimension of time is far more complex. So this is the character for autumn, and the calligraphy teacher's instructions show how the dimension of time might be explained to a modern learner through a static image. 2 of the instructions are couched in verbs of motion, But I want to draw your attention to the note on the right, where we are instructed to pause at a specific point of the stroke before continuing. Brush writing has rhythm. And since we're talking about time, I can show you in real time, as well as the perpendicular movement, which uses different parts of the brush, you can see that there are moments of speed and of slowness. And I want to emphasize that if you are literate in the brush, the two-dimensional figure on the page clearly indicates fast and slow passage of the brush. So the written word displays quite clearly the rhythm of its production. So here I'm returning to the 18th century with a picture of a writing lesson to refine these 4 dimensions a little. And we see that the girl is holding the brush much higher up than either of the writers we saw in the videos. And based on the early modern materials I've looked at and my own calligraphy classes, I suspect that the low, tight grip that we saw in the videos is strongly influenced by the way we hold pens today. This girl is also a student participating in the lesson, just as we watched the videos which were produced for learners. Because writing production has movement in time and space, real-time observation is really key to learning. And on the left of the desk is the writing model, which the student copies. And in the center of the desk, we can see the student's copy paper with black scribbles on it. And it's these black scribbles that are important here. They're not there because she's terrible at writing. It's because she's not learning to make the correct shape on the page. The two-dimensional line produced by her brush on the paper is not in itself the object of the lesson. She is learning to make the correct gesture with her body, and it's the correct gesture which produces the appropriate line. And the gesture does not only involve fingers, but as you can see, the whole hand, the arm. Good execution depends on the whole body's posture and even on the writer's breath. So the 4 dimensions of brush writing show the writing body in time and space. And we can notice that the teacher is holding the student's hand because she does this in order to transmit all 4 dimensions of writing through the embodied feeling of writing, teacher to student, body to body. So far I've been talking about writing production, and I've said that the 4 dimensions of writing are legible to those who are brush literate. So there's 2 important points to make here. First, in Japan before the 20th century, pretty much all writing was notionally brush written. So when words were carved into stone or wood, they're carved with attention to all 4 dimensions. So where the brush would press into the paper, the letter form is carved deeper. And where the brush would skim, the line is shallower. So whatever the medium, the brush and its action in ink on paper are implicit. And secondly, when I say those who were brush literate, that meant everyone who was literate. What's crucial to note here is that writing preceded reading. In Japan, you learnt to read through learning to write. So the body is deeply implicated in reading, which emanates from knowledge of writing production. We read now, as I suggest, based on a 2-dimensional understanding of text. We recognize shapes on the surface, and we don't need to be able to reproduce the shapes in order to read them. And if we consider 4 dimensions in human terms, as experienced through the body, this raises questions of cognition, and we might consider mirror neurons or the mirror system, in which embodied actions of others are recognized through the reproduction of the same actions in the brain of the observer. Cognition is not my field, so all I'm going to say is, in order to learn to read, you learn to write, and reading brush writing involved literacy in embodied gesture as well as language. Calligraphic practice involves copying a text But in copying a calligraphic model, one is not only attempting to write the words well, but one is carefully tracing the original writer's four-dimensional gestures, their embodiment. Like learning to dance, one learns to move one's body in the appropriate manner. And the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu discusses the encultured body in terms of hexis. He says, body hexis speaks directly to the motor function in the form of a pattern of postures that is both individual and systematic, because it's linked to a whole system of techniques involving the body and tools and charged with a host of social meanings and values. Now, for Bourdieu, hexis never reaches the level of discourse. And instead, he describes children as attentive to the gestures and postures which express everything that goes to make an accomplished adult. A way of walking, a tilt of the head, facial expressions, ways of sitting, and of using implements. And educators in the early modern period explicitly encouraged the simultaneous development not only of literacy, writing literacy, but also of bodily postures and gestures, which, at least for a certain class of child, might involve training in the martial arts, how to serve tea, and of course, how to write. And actually, I had a calligraphy teacher who was also a kendo teacher, which is a kind of sword fighting. And it was through her that I learned how closely allied these two seemingly unconnected practices really are. So, unlike sword fighting, writing leaves something behind. Japanese calligraphy is a record of a performance of a text by a writer, and the instrument is an extremely sensitive seismograph of the body. So particularly in the kind of highly cursive script you see here, even remediated twice, once into print and once into pixels on the screen, the seismograph exposes the writer's body to the reader. Gripping the brush too tightly or holding your elbow too close to your body will show in the lines on the page. Equally, any uncertainty, tension, distraction, or hesitation will be exposed by the brush. And if we think for a moment about uncertainty or hesitation or speed, these are things which can signify more than mere movement. The ink marks might index a person's physical condition, such as sickness or old age, or their emotional state, such as distress. And there is a long history in Japan of discourses of affect being transmitted by writing, by the material form of writing. For example, in the 11th century classic, The Tale of Genji, I'm showing a section of the early 12th century scroll of the Tale of Genji, which describes the death of the protagonist's deeply beloved wife. And the tangles here speak of the anguish of this scene. But this same trope is present in this 18th century book. Here, the distraught fictional heroine writes to her beloved from her deathbed, and the page expresses her disordered mind and body in a way which contrasts to her earlier letters, one of which you can see on the right, although you might need to take my word for it that the one on the left is scrawling and tangled, and the one on the right is calm and clear. So I'm going to return to this 18th century book in a moment, but first, I want to show you this, which is the real ink of a 17th century courtesan. So we can admire this with the dyed paper, cut gold, and we can appreciate how the surface interacts with the script laid on it. And we may see something of the fluid poise with which she writes. Crucially, and entirely unlike other expressions of the body, the line of ink creates meaning only in concert with its linguistic content. The original owner of this calligraphy would have unrolled the scroll and read this large character for autumn, which you see at the center of the screen, set within a cluster of less signifying letter forms, each positioned in spatial as well as linguistic relations with each other. The semantic content is linear, but the placement of letter forms is not. And then through the pressure of the brush and spatial relations, we read more than the mere words say. Any analysis of this text must start from its linguistic content, its semantic, pragmatic, deictic aspects. These things are absolutely central, but they're endlessly entangled with the 4 dimensions of the writing itself. So the brush is remarkable in its power to communicate all kinds of indexical meanings which relate to, draw on, or are clarified when considering 4 dimensions. And I'm going to briefly expand on the 18th century book I mentioned because it demonstrates some of the meanings that are available only when read 4-dimensionally and with attention to the encultured body. I've already given away the ending to say this is a letter from the dying heroine, so spoiler, she dies at the end. But the book is an epistolary romance, and the letters the heroine writes construct her character for the pre-20th century reader. So I'm going to give the heroine her name, which is Usuyuki. And you can see part of one of her letters on the right, which compared to the left page is vertically extended and spacious. And the book gives us the fictional character's letters in her fictional handwriting. All the rest of the text, whether it's narration or the letters sent to Usuyuki, are in an unmarked form. And immediately the book becomes more focused on the character of Usuyuki than it might otherwise, because readers experience Usuyuki's letters in a particular way. So I want to pause here and just consider the vertical extension of her writing, which is characteristic of a certain type of text, which indexes a certain type of social relationship, and thus already carries paralinguistic meaning. More vertical extension means longer lines, which are not only more difficult, but in terms of the seismograph, both the physical body and the social meaning emanating from the body are more legible. But at the same time, the expressing body is exposing itself only to an understanding body. The reader is not only a reader of words, but also a reader of gesture and posture and the body. The circuit of understanding for this text is constructed and interpreted in 4 dimensions. And here I'm showing a selection of letters from Usuyuki to her love interest, and you can see the very different texture of each letter. And these here construct her effective stance in the moment of correspondence. And I've arranged these from left to right in terms of intensity of affect, from cool to warm, and then on the far right, her dying letter. And these meanings are partly constructed in the way we normally understand text to construct meaning, through language and all of these complex aspects that we've been discussing for the past few days. But meaning is also partly constructed through the 4 dimensions of her writing in time and space. I've already mentioned her physical and emotional distress on the right-hand side, but the seismograph of the brush exposes Usuyuki's writing body to her lover in a way that also increases from left to right. The more vertically extended writing of the second letter is more intimate than the first because it allows him to read her writing body through her brushwork. And here we see her effective stance changing from a kind of self-concealing reserve on the left. She gradually uncloaks herself in her writing. So the exposure of the body here is an exposure of affects and other meanings associated with the body. So if we look at the right-hand side, this mise-en-page, non-linear mise-en-page, not only indexes sincerity in a pragmatic sense, but it performs sincerity with brush strokes which give the writer nowhere to hide. So, how do we read this kind of writing today? First of all, we make it look like this because we need script to be transformed into the kind of writing we can actually read. And for us, the human hand is at best an inconvenience, and in the Japanese case, often a complete barrier to reading. But also for us, writing traditionally primarily is a container for semantic content, transmitting information from place to place into the eyes of readers. We have come to depend on writing that has been abstracted away from the human originator. Indeed, we live in a world structured by a typographic paradigm where typography is the regime of knowledge. I can't submit an article to a journal in handwriting, however beautiful my handwriting is, which it's not. This book exists to modern readers only because it's been transcribed into typography. But irrespective of the many different kinds of contents transmitted by pre-modern writing, organized by embodied experiences of four-dimensional worlds, we extract the two-dimensional content that fits the automated text of the typographic paradigm, because this is the content we're most comfortable with, and we discard the rest. The four dimensions of Japanese brush-written writing remain available to us as long as the ink persists on paper. What we lack is the capacity to read this writing fully, and I'm not talking about paleography skills here, although I am also talking about paleography skills. This is writing that allows the transmission of many kinds of contents which speak to the four-dimensional world of the embodied writer and reader. And the typographic paradigm has transformed animate writing, a verbal noun, a gerund, into disembodied and inanimate text. That, in turn, transforms this piece of writing by another 17th century courtesan into art when it was and remains writing. So is it possible to reclaim the full four dimensions of reading? Maybe. Although we work within a knowledge regime that's governed by abstracted and automated text, and although we may tend to read two-dimensionally, we still perceive and experience the world in four dimensions. I'm pretty certain that everybody in that room today, and even myself on Zoom and the other people on Zoom, we are human with bodies. And in an increasingly digital world, I think this is something worth remembering. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully I have not overrun too far. I can see some stuff in the chat, which I will have a look at. Yeah, I think I've overrun. So maybe I can reply to the...
Absolutely. Well, we have to... More questions? But if you're unsure, I can start with the online questions. So a comment by James Myers. Time and pressure and handwriting can now be recorded on touch screens or tablets and then automatically recorded and analyzed, even if the final two-dimensional result reveals nothing about how the written form was produced. I don't know if you find this thought inspiring or depressing.
I find the technology that we use, I have mixed feelings because obviously it's amazing and I am able to participate in this conference and read everybody's stuff. I think it changes us, and in positive and in less positive ways. That's my short answer. If I was there, I would like occupy the entire coffee break talking about this. But I think that there are things that we don't see in writing because we're so accustomed to this surface screen. So not only speaking Japanese studies, but in so many times I see people doing textual analysis based on a typographic transcription without ever looking at the original text.
Right, yeah.
And that, I think, is a massive, massive problem when we're doing any kind of textual analysis.
And a
I
question.
wasn't answering your question at all, sorry.
Just a comment. You answered. You're mixed.
Yeah, yeah, very mixed.
So a question by Arvind Iyengar. Any parallels of such calligraphic forms in other writing systems that use the same underlying characters? Or is it an instance of Japanese-specific calligraphy that was unknown in other sinographic regions?
So that's a really interesting question I don't know the answer to. This is partly due to the technology of the brush, and that is obviously not unique to Japan. Partly this is about the Japanese culture, the encultured body in the Japanese context. So I would be really interested in comparing with like Chinese. It's a conversation I have planned about whether this works in China, because I think the technology is the same, but the idea of the body and how we are in time and space is different in different scripts. So that the tech, and even then, you know, we saw, I loved on the first day, I can't remember the presenter, but he had the clay tablet and the instrument. I think that's really, really important to understand what writing does.